Arrival of the unknown. In the quiet, sprawling hills of northern Colorado, the night was undisturbed. Stars shimmered in the clear sky, painting a tapestry that felt vast and untouched. In a small town nestled between mountains and valleys, only a few lights blinked, reminding anyone awake that humanity had claimed a part of this world. One of those lights belonged to Zach Hart's cabin. An engineer by trade, Zach was a bit of an enigma to the town. He'd always been fascinated by the unusual and unexplainable, spending his nights tinkering with gadgets in his cluttered workshop. Tonight, though, even he wasn't expecting the kind of unusual that was about to turn his life upside down. A sharp, burning light streaked across the sky, faster than any meteor he'd ever seen. Zach bolted out of his chair, his coffee spilling over the workbench as he raced to the window. He watched as the bright, greenish light shot toward the hills just beyond his property and, with a deafening roar, disappeared behind a ridge. Zach didn't hesitate. This was no ordinary sight. He grabbed his flashlight, pulled on a jacket, and dashed out into the brisk night air. The ground shook as Zach sprinted over the hill, his heart pounding as adrenaline spurred him forward. He reached the top and froze at the sight below, a massive crater, still smoldering and filled with the faint glow of something alien. Heat radiated from the crater's edges, and as Zach's eyes adjusted, he made out the wreckage of what looked like a spaceship nestled among the smoking rocks. For a moment, he was struck speechless. But as he stared, he saw movement near the wreck. A figure was stumbling out, silhouetted against the glow. Despite the damage to the ship, it was clear that this was no ordinary craft, and the being emerging from it was no ordinary creature. She was tall, with a shimmering, almost ethereal blue skin that cast a soft light across the crater. Her eyes, a deep amethyst, glistened with a mixture of pain and defiance. Zach's heart raced as the realization hit him. He was staring at an alien. He stepped forward cautiously, making sure not to startle her, but she was alert. Her gaze snapped to him, a mix of wariness and guarded hostility. She held something close to her chest, an artifact that pulsed with a light of its own. "Are you okay?" Zach managed to stammer, feeling more foolish by the second. He didn't know if she could understand him, or if she even spoke any Earth languages. He wasn't even sure if he should approach any closer. To his surprise, she responded, her voice soft but commanding. "Who are you?" she asked in perfect, though accented, English. Her tone was both royal and distant, but Zach detected an underlying urgency. "Zach Hart," he replied, lowering his flashlight to show he wasn't a threat. "I live nearby. Well, sort of nearby." He nodded towards the mountains, trying to seem as unthreatening as possible. Her gaze remained fixed on him, assessing. "Zach Hart, I am Eliana, Princess of the Varian Empire," she said, taking a small step forward, but wobbling slightly as if injured. "I was ambushed." She clutched the artifact tighter to her chest, its glow intensifying with each word. "And now I need help." Zach's mind whirred. He had expected to see a meteorite or some broken satellite, maybe a scorched patch of Earth. But here he was, face to face with an alien princess. He took a deep breath. "Help. Right, of course. What do you need?" Eliana's expression softened, just for a moment, as if she could sense his sincerity. "My ship is destroyed. My enemies have followed me here. And this artifact," she held it up carefully, "is the only thing keeping me safe. But I need a place to hide, somewhere safe." Zach nodded quickly. "All right, follow me. I've got a workshop up the hill. It's small, but it's hidden enough." She hesitated, glancing back at her wrecked ship before looking to Zach. He could sense her weighing her options, deciding whether to trust him. But with a faint nod, she took a step forward, and he reached out to help her up the incline. Her grip was strong, but her steps were unsteady, as if her injuries went beyond the visible. They made their way to Zach's cabin, the silent night interrupted only by the soft crunch of their footsteps and Eliana's labored breathing. Once inside, Zach led her to a couch, where she sank with visible relief. He pulled a blanket over her shoulders, unsure what else to do for someone of extraterrestrial origin. He grabbed his first aid kit, setting it on the table beside her, though he doubted it held much for someone of her physiology. "Is there anything specific I can get for you? Water? Food?" Zach asked, watching her as she seemed to examine the space around her, both curious and wary. She looked at him, a slight smirk crossing her lips despite her evident pain. "Water will be fine, Zach Hart," she replied, trying to mask her discomfort with a stoic expression. As he fetched a glass of water, she took a deep breath, her shoulders visibly relaxing as the immediate danger faded. For the first time, Zach noticed the intricate tattoos tracing down her arms, glowing faintly under her skin, like a language or symbol he couldn't decipher. Eliana took the water, sipping slowly, and watched him over the rim of the glass. "You must have questions," she said finally, her voice soft. "More than I could count," Zach admitted with a faint chuckle. "But I'll start with this. Who was chasing you? And why?" Her gaze darkened, and she held the artifact protectively. "I carry a device called the Heartstone," she said. "It's a key to immense power, a power that my enemies, the Rayan Dominion, would use to enslave entire worlds. I escaped with it, hoping to find allies in distant galaxies, but my ship was damaged in the escape, and I found myself here, on your planet." "Lucky for you," Zach muttered, still trying to comprehend everything. "But how did you just happen to know English?" Eliana managed a weak smile. "Universal translation device," she said, pointing to a small earpiece barely visible beneath her silver hair. "Most advanced civilizations keep one at hand for situations like this." "Of course," Zach said, shaking his head, almost laughing at the absurdity. "I just didn't think I'd ever be in a situation like this." He paused, thinking of what she'd said. "So, they'll come looking for you." "They're likely tracking the Heartstone," she replied. "But your cabin, it's far from the city. That may give us time." The quiet night resumed, tense and uncertain. Zach didn't know what he was supposed to feel, let alone do next. He knew only that he had to help her. She was alone, on a planet she hadn't planned to land on, hunted by enemies he couldn't even imagine. "What happens if they find us?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. Eliana's face was grim. "They won't stop until they retrieve the Heartstone, even if that means destroying everything and everyone in their path." She closed her eyes briefly, as if contemplating the weight of her words. Zach's mind raced. His quiet life in this remote town, his small workshop, his daily routines, all of it felt so small compared to the galaxy-spanning threats and alien empires that now encroached upon his reality. But he couldn't turn away now. He made a decision, one he didn't fully understand but felt deeply. "Then we'll have to keep you safe," he said, his voice steady. He had no idea how he'd do it, but he felt the resolve setting in. "I don't know much about aliens or Heartstones, but I'll help you however I can." Eliana met his gaze, and for the first time, her guarded expression softened. "Thank you, Zach Hart," she said. "Perhaps there's more power here than I first realized." As they sat in the quiet, the glow of the Heartstone pulsing between them, Zach felt the first stirrings of something remarkable. A purpose he hadn't known was missing from his life until that very moment, and he knew whatever lay ahead, his life would never be the same. Shadows of the Rayan. As dawn broke over the quiet valley, Zach Hart's cabin was bathed in a soft, golden light. Inside, however, the atmosphere was tense and filled with an anxious stillness. Princess Eliana sat on the worn leather couch, gazing out the window with a guarded expression. Her hands rested on the Heartstone, its steady glow a quiet reminder of the danger looming over them. Zach moved around his workshop, gathering materials and making makeshift repairs to anything he thought might be useful. He couldn't ignore the weight of what she'd told him the previous night, the powerful relic, the unstoppable empire chasing her, the imminent danger to Earth if they found her here. His simple, isolated life had been upended overnight, and while he still felt overwhelmed, a strange excitement had begun to settle in. Suddenly, Eliana spoke, her voice breaking the silence. "We don't have much time, Zach." She stood up, her tall, graceful form casting a shadow on the floor. "The Rayons will be tracking the Heartstone's energy signature. It won't take them long to pinpoint our location." Zach nodded, not entirely sure what to do next. "Is there any way to hide its signal?" he asked, trying to think of a solution as he scanned his shelves for any equipment that might help. Eliana shook her head, a hint of worry in her usually composed expression. "The Heartstone is ancient technology, beyond even the most advanced Varian science. There's only one way to mask it, a protective shield powered by the Heartstone itself, but it requires a connection with someone compatible with its energy." Zach raised an eyebrow. "And by compatible, you mean?" She hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Only one with a rare type of energy, something your people might call life force, can activate the Heartstone in this way. I had hoped to find a warrior in the Theron system, but here I am, stranded, and our options limited." Her gaze drifted to Zach, an almost apologetic look in her eyes. "If the Heartstone senses compatibility, it may bond to you." The gravity of her words hit him. Zach's hands stilled as he processed what she was asking of him. This wasn't some simple rescue mission. It was a request for him to become bound to an ancient alien artifact, potentially drawing him into a fight with enemies far beyond his understanding. He took a deep breath, weighing the risks, but something inside him had already decided. "If it'll help keep you, and everyone else on Earth, safe, then I'm in. Let's do it." Eliana's face softened, the guarded expression melting into something close to gratitude. "You're braver than most warriors I've met, Zach Hart." He grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "Let's just hope I'm also luckier than most warriors you've met." But his smile faded as he added, "What do I need to do?" "Sit down and hold the Heartstone," she said, extending the glowing relic toward him. "It will feel strange at first, but if it accepts you, you'll feel a warmth spreading from your hands to your heart. From there, you and the Heartstone will be linked." Zach took a deep breath and reached out, his fingers closing around the Heartstone. It felt cool to the touch at first, but within seconds, a warmth started to radiate from it, intensifying until it was almost too hot to hold. Just as he thought he couldn't bear it any longer, the heat settled into a steady warmth that seemed to pulse in sync with his heartbeat. He looked up at Eliana, his eyes wide with awe and trepidation. I can feel it," he whispered, his voice thick with wonder. She smiled, relief evident in her expression. "It worked. The Heartstone has accepted you as its protector." She took a step back, her expression more serious now. "With this bond, you'll be able to shield its energy signature. The Rayons will find it harder to track us, for now." Zach let out a slow breath, feeling the artifact's energy merge with his own. "So, what now?" Eliana's expression hardened. "Now we need a plan. We can't keep running forever. The Rayons are relentless, and they'll stop at nothing to get the Heartstone." Her gaze turned distant as she continued. "I had allies back in Varia, but I can't reach them from here. The technology on this planet isn't advanced enough." Zach frowned, his mind racing. "What if we fight back? I know we're outnumbered, and I don't know anything about alien combat, but I have some tech that might help. It's not advanced, but I can modify it." Eliana looked at him, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "You're willing to risk everything." He shrugged, trying to sound braver than he felt. "We're already in this deep, right? Besides, I have a few tricks up my sleeve." She gave him a nod of approval. "Then, let's get to work." Over the next few hours, they worked together in Zach's workshop, modifying his equipment and strategizing. Zach explained some of the technology he had: basic drones, infrared sensors, and even an old EMP generator he'd salvaged from military-grade equipment. It wasn't much, but with Eliana's advanced knowledge and a few clever adjustments, they managed to create a makeshift defense system around the cavern. Eliana shared what she knew about the Rayon soldiers' weaknesses. Their armor was resilient to most forms of energy, but surprisingly vulnerable to kinetic force, a fact she'd learned from her battles on distant worlds. Together, they rigged traps and defensive measures that utilized simple mechanics and brute force. As they worked, Zack found himself drawn to Aliana's determination. She was a princess of a faraway empire, accustomed to the grandeur of her people's technology and strength, yet here she was, adapting to Earth's humble tools, fighting alongside him as an equal. The two of them were as different as could be, yet they'd formed an alliance built on mutual respect and trust. Finally, as dusk began to settle, they sat down for a brief rest. The cabin was now fortified as best as they could manage. Every sensor, wire, and gadget was in place, each strategically positioned to maximize their chances if the Rayans found them. But just as Zack began to feel a sliver of hope, the cabin's proximity alarm blared, shattering the brief calm. They exchanged a look, and Aliana's expression turned grim. "They're here," she said, standing and pulling a small, alien blade from her belt. The blade shimmered with an otherworldly energy, a weapon far more advanced than anything Zack had ever seen. Zack grabbed a makeshift rifle he'd modified, his hands steady despite his pounding heart. "Let's hope all this prep pays off." They moved to the small, reinforced windows of the cabin, peering out into the fading light. A dark shape appeared at the edge of the woods, its outline just visible through the trees. More followed, each moving with a precision that unnerved Zack. They were close enough now that he could make out their strange, angular armor and the glow of their energy weapons. One of the Rayam soldiers raised his hand, a signal, and suddenly they charged forward, breaking the stillness of the forest as they approached the cabin. Eliana's voice was calm and clear. "Remember the traps we set. They'll buy us time, but we have to be ready for close combat." Zack nodded, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Let's make them work for it." The first Rayam soldier triggered a tripwire, setting off a hidden EMP burst that temporarily scrambled their electronic systems. Several soldiers staggered, their movements disoriented, while Zack took aim and fired, the impact knocking one of them back. Another soldier tripped over a concealed pitfall, tumbling into a makeshift snare that Zack had rigged up. But as effective as their defenses were, Zack and Eliana knew they couldn't hold off the entire squad alone. The soldiers adapted quickly, moving with deadly efficiency, bypassing the traps and zeroing in on the cabin. Just as they breached the outer defenses, Eliana turned to Zack. "The Heartstone can amplify your strength, but it will drain you. Are you willing to use it?" He nodded without hesitation. "Let's do it." She placed her hand over his, guiding his focus toward the artifact. As they concentrated, a surge of energy flooded through him, a warmth that felt like pure power, raw and untamed. The Heartstone responded to his determination, its glow brightening until it filled the room with a brilliant light. Outside, the Rayam soldiers halted, momentarily blinded. Zack felt a strange clarity, as though he could sense the soldiers' movements, anticipate their attacks before they made them. Acting on pure instinct, he raised his rifle and fired with precision, each shot finding its mark. Beside him, Eliana moved with a fluid grace, her alien blade striking down any Rayan who breached the door. Despite her injuries, she fought with unyielding resolve, her movements a testament to her royal training. But even with the Heartstone's power, the fight was brutal. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and Zack could feel his energy waning. Sweat dripped down his face, his muscles aching as the Heartstone's power drained him with each use. Just when it seemed like they might be overwhelmed, the remaining soldiers hesitated, retreating as if in response to an unseen command. The few that were left quickly regrouped, vanishing into the forest as swiftly as they had arrived. Zack collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily, his body aching from the Heartstone's strain. Eliana knelt beside him, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. "You did well, Zack Hart," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "But they'll return, and with greater numbers." He nodded, too exhausted to speak, but his resolve was clear. They'd survived the first wave, but he knew this was just the beginning. Together, they'd face whatever came next, united by a bond forged in the fires of battle and the unlikeliest of alliances. And for the first time, Zack felt that his small, quiet life had transformed into something extraordinary, something worth fighting for. Secrets of the Heartstone. The early morning light seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls as Zack stirred awake, his body aching from the previous night's brutal skirmish. He could still feel the lingering effects of the Heartstone's power coursing through his veins, like an aftershock from a powerful surge. Beside him, Eliana was already awake, her gaze fixed on the Heartstone as it rested between them, its glow dimmed but steady. She seemed lost in thought, her expression a mix of worry and something deeper, something Zack could only interpret as resolve. "Eliana," Zack said, pulling himself up from the makeshift bedroll on the floor, "what happens now?" "Last night. They'll be back, won't they?" She nodded, her gaze still focused on the Heartstone. "Yes, and they'll return with reinforcements. Rayans are relentless. They know I'm here, and they know I'm weakened. They'll keep coming until either they have the Heartstone or we stop them." The weight of her words settled over Zack like a storm cloud, but he nodded. He'd already come this far. There was no turning back now. "Then we need a better plan. We can't hold out here forever, especially not against an entire army." Eliana looked at him, her violet eyes searching his face. "There may be another way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A way to unlock the full potential of the Heartstone." Zack tilted his head, intrigued. "What do you mean? I thought the Heartstone was already bound to me." "It is," Eliana replied, "but the Heartstone's true power isn't just in its defensive abilities. Legends say it holds a connection to an ancient source of energy, something so powerful that it could shift the balance of the entire galaxy. But to unlock it fully, it requires a bond, a true bond, between the Heartstone's bearer and its keeper." Zack raised an eyebrow. "A bond? Like what, a contract or something?" She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of her expression. "Not quite. It's difficult to explain. It's not a contract or a physical binding, but a union of purpose and trust. It's as if the Heartstone can sense the intentions and hearts of those who carry it, and it only reveals its true power to those who are truly aligned with its mission." Zack took a deep breath, processing her words. "So how do we form this bond?" Eliana hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "It's not something that can be forced. The Heartstone is ancient and wise. It responds to intent and spirit. We have to prove ourselves worthy, both to each other and to the Heartstone itself. Only then will it grant us the strength we need to overcome the Rayans." The gravity of her words settled over Zack, and he looked down at the Heartstone, feeling a newfound respect for the mysterious artifact. "All right, so we have to work together, build trust. I think we're already on the right path." She smiled softly. "Perhaps, but there's another part to this bond, one that requires vulnerability. The Heartstone doesn't just demand trust, it demands openness, a willingness to reveal oneself completely, without walls or defenses. That is something we'll both have to consider if we want to unlock its full potential." Zack felt a surge of uncertainty. Vulnerability wasn't something he was accustomed to. His life had always been about building defenses, both physical and emotional. But as he looked into Eliana's eyes, he realized that this was no ordinary situation. He was facing a threat beyond anything he'd ever known, and if they were to survive, he'd have to find a way to let down his walls. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. "I'm willing to try. If it means keeping you and Earth safe, then I'm in." Eliana gave a small nod, respect evident in her gaze. "Thank you, Zack Hart. You have no idea how much this means." They spent the next few hours in quiet preparation. Eliana showed Zack techniques for connecting with the Heartstone, meditative exercises that helped him tune into its energy. At first, it felt awkward, almost foreign, but as he practiced, he began to feel a subtle shift within himself, a growing awareness of the Heartstone's presence. It was as if the artifact was alive, a silent partner in their struggle, waiting for them to prove themselves. As the day wore on, Zach and Eliana took turns monitoring the perimeter, watching for any sign of the Rayan forces. Zach's makeshift security system, though primitive by Varian standards, was still functional, and he felt a small sense of satisfaction every time one of the sensors pinged with an alert. But by mid-afternoon, they received their first sign of trouble. One of the outermost sensors triggered, followed by another. The Rayans were closing in. "They're here," Eliana said, her voice calm but alert. She gripped her alien blade tightly, her eyes scanning the forest. Zach nodded, feeling a familiar surge of adrenaline. He checked the Heartstone, feeling its warmth in his hands. "Are you ready?" Eliana glanced at him, a flicker of something, perhaps fear or anticipation, crossing her face. "As ready as I'll ever be." They took up their positions. Zach crouched behind a cluster of rocks near the edge of the clearing, and Eliana beside him, her blade poised and ready. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds the soft rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. Then, from the shadows, figures began to emerge. Rayan soldiers, their sleek, angular armor glinting in the dappled sunlight. They moved with precision, their formation tight and disciplined. Zach counted at least a dozen, though he suspected there were more waiting in the trees. One of the soldiers raised a hand, signaling the others to halt. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Zach and Eliana with a cold, calculating intensity. His voice echoed through the clearing, distorted by the helmet's built-in translator. "Princess Eliana of Veria," he called, his tone formal and unyielding. "You are hereby ordered to surrender the Heartstone and return with us to the Rayan Dominion. Resistance will result in the complete annihilation of this location." Eliana stepped forward, her expression defiant. "I will never surrender the Heartstone to the likes of you," she said, her voice ringing with strength. "Return to your empire and tell your superiors that Veria will not bow to the Rayans." The soldier's expression remained unreadable behind his visor, but Zach could sense the tension in the air. Without another word, the soldier raised his weapon, and the battle erupted. Zach felt the Heartstone pulse in his hands, a surge of energy flooding his senses as he and Eliana moved as one, countering the Rayans' attacks with a fierce determination. The Heartstone seemed to guide him, its energy amplifying his reflexes, his movements sharper and faster than he'd ever thought possible. Beside him, Eliana moved with a deadly grace, her blade slicing through the air with precision, each strike aimed to disable or disarm rather than kill. But the Rayans were skilled, their tactics relentless. They adapted quickly, shifting their formation to counter Zach and Eliana's every move. Zach could feel his energy waning, the strain of the Heartstone's power taking its toll. Just as he thought they might be overwhelmed, he felt a surge of warmth, a strange, comforting presence that seemed to fill him with renewed strength. He glanced at Eliana, realizing with a start that the Heartstone's energy was flowing between them, connecting them in a way he hadn't expected. Eliana met his gaze, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, and in that moment, Zach understood. This was the bond she had spoken of, the connection that would unlock the Heartstone's full potential. Without a word, they moved in perfect sync, their attacks coordinated and seamless, as if they were two halves of a single entity. The Rayans faltered, their formation breaking under the combined force of Zach and Eliana's assault. One by one, the soldiers fell, each defeat a blow to their morale. Finally, the last of them retreated, disappearing into the trees, leaving Zach and Eliana alone in the clearing. Zach lowered his weapon, breathing heavily, the adrenaline still coursing through him. He looked at Eliana, a sense of awe and gratitude filling him. "We did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eliana nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "Yes, we did." They stood in silence, the forest around them eerily quiet in the aftermath of the battle. For the first time, Zack felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that they had found something powerful, something that went beyond mere survival. In that moment, he realized that they were no longer just allies, they were partners, bound by a shared purpose and a connection that transcended words. As they returned to the cabin, Zack felt the Heartstone's warmth settle into a steady, reassuring pulse, as if it too had acknowledged the bond they had forged. And for the first time since this strange journey had begun, he felt a glimmer of hope that they might just have a chance. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The Rayans would return, stronger and more determined than ever, and they would have to be ready. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, united by the Heartstone and the unbreakable bond they had formed. A plan for resistance. The morning after the battle, Zack and Eliana woke to a quiet that seemed almost surreal after the chaos of the previous day. The Rayan soldiers had been relentless, but they'd won a small victory. It was only a reprieve, Zack knew, a moment to gather their strength before the next inevitable attack. He'd barely slept, his mind churning over every possible plan, every scenario he could imagine to protect Eliana and the Heartstone from the Rayan threat. Eliana, however, seemed calm, almost serene, as she sat by the small stream near the cabin. Her eyes were closed, her fingers lightly touching the Heartstone, which rested on her lap, pulsing softly with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Zack watched her from the doorway, marveling at her poise and the strange, otherworldly beauty that seemed to radiate from her in those quiet moments. He approached her quietly, his footsteps soft on the grass. "Eliana, we need a new plan," he said, his voice low. "We can't just keep waiting for the Rayans to find us. We need to take the fight to them." She opened her eyes, looking up at him with a calm but intense gaze. "I agree," she replied, nodding. "But if we're to face them head-on, we need more than just strategy. We need allies, resources, and knowledge of their movements. The Rayans are strategic. They won't just send another small squad. They'll bring a force capable of overwhelming us." Zack frowned, crouching beside her. "How do we get that kind of information? I'm not exactly connected to the Galactic Intel network." Eliana considered his question, her gaze distant. "There's a device in my ship's wreckage, something I couldn't access during the escape. It's called a locator beacon, and it's connected to the Varian Empire's emergency frequency. If I can get it up and running, it might allow me to contact the resistance forces from Varia who are stationed nearby. They could give us intel, resources, maybe even backup." Zack felt a spark of hope. "Then let's go back to the crash site and see if we can find it." But Eliana shook her head. "The crash site is likely being monitored. The Rayans would have positioned sentries nearby to capture any signal I might attempt to send. We'll need to approach carefully and disable any surveillance they set up." Zack nodded, formulating a plan in his mind. "All right, we'll take the long way around through the forest. I've got some camo gear that might help us stay hidden, and we'll use the cover of night. If we're lucky, we can avoid detection." Eliana gave him a small smile, her eyes glinting with determination. "You're beginning to think like a Varian warrior, Zack Hart. I knew I made the right choice trusting you." They spent the rest of the day preparing, gathering supplies and testing the camouflage Zack had pieced together with what limited resources he had. Eliana's knowledge of Rayan technology was invaluable, guiding him as they built makeshift signal blockers to interfere with any detection devices the Rayans might have set up around the wreckage. That night, under the cover of darkness, they set out. The forest was dense and quiet, the shadows deep and all-consuming. Zack led the way, his senses heightened, every sound a potential warning. Eliana followed close behind, her movements so silent she seemed more like a wraith than a flesh and blood being. They reached the outskirts of the crash site without incident. From the edge of the trees, Zack could see the scorched earth, the broken remains of Eliana's ship, and, just as she predicted, a small contingent of Rayan soldiers patrolling the area. Zack counted 6 in total, but he knew there were likely more hidden in the shadows. Eliana crouched beside him, her voice barely a whisper. There's a blind spot between the two larger rocks, near the edge of the clearing. If we can slip through undetected, I'll be able to reach the ship and locate the beacon. Zack glanced at the soldiers, their patrol routes, and nodded. I'll create a distraction, he said, his voice low but firm. It'll draw them away long enough for you to get to the ship. Eliana looked at him, concern flashing in her eyes. That's too risky, if they catch you. He cut her off with a small smile. I didn't come this far to back down now. Besides, I'm pretty good at staying out of sight. He patted his camo gear and gave her a wink. Reluctantly, she nodded. Be careful, Zack. I need you alive. Zack crept around the far side of the clearing, positioning himself near a cluster of rocks. He took a deep breath, then threw a small rock toward the opposite side of the clearing, hitting a metal scrap that let out a sharp clang. Instantly, two of the soldiers turned and began moving toward the sound, their weapons raised, leaving the path to the ship slightly less guarded. Eliana took her chance, slipping through the shadows and moving toward her ship with silent precision. Zack watched her go, his heart pounding as he held his breath, willing the soldiers not to turn around. He stayed perfectly still, knowing that even the slightest movement could give away his position. As Eliana reached the ship, she disappeared into the wreckage, her form vanishing into the shadows. Zack felt a surge of relief, but he knew the danger was far from over. He continued to watch the Rayan soldiers, his grip tight on his makeshift weapon, ready to spring into action if they spotted her. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, Eliana re-emerged from the ship, a small disc-like device in her hand. She gave Zack a brief nod, the signal that she had what they came for. Carefully, she began to retrace her steps, moving back toward him with the same silent grace. But just as she neared the edge of the clearing, one of the soldiers turned, his gaze landing on her silhouette. Zack didn't hesitate. He threw another rock, this one landing closer to the soldiers and causing enough noise to redirect their attention. They immediately moved toward the sound, and Eliana slipped back into the trees undetected. When she reached him, they both exhaled in relief. You did it, he whispered, a grin breaking across his face. Eliana held out the device, her eyes alight with victory. Now we have a chance. They retreated deeper into the forest, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the crash site before stopping to examine the device. It was smaller than Zack expected, no larger than his palm, with intricate markings and controls that glowed faintly in the dark. Eliana activated it, and a soft hum filled the air. She adjusted a few settings, her fingers moving quickly over the controls. This beacon is designed to send an encrypted signal. If any of my allies are nearby, they'll receive it and come to our aid. Zack watched her, his heart pounding with anticipation. And if they're not nearby? She looked at him, her expression somber. Then we'll have to find another way to survive. They waited in silence as the device transmitted, the seconds ticking by with agonizing slowness. Zack's mind raced, envisioning every possible outcome, every worst-case scenario. But then, just as he began to lose hope, the device emitted a soft beep. Eliana's face lit up. Someone received the signal, she whispered, her voice filled with hope. She adjusted the device, and a faint voice crackled through, distorted but audible. Princess Eliana, this is Commander Kale of the Varian Resistance. We received your distress signal. State your location and condition. Eliana's relief was palpable as she replied, her voice steady. Commander Kale, I'm currently on a pre-quantum planet called Earth. I have the Heartstone, but I am under pursuit by Rayan forces. Request immediate assistance. There was a pause, and then Commander Kale's voice returned. Understood, Princess. We have a small strike team in your sector. We'll make our way to your location, but it will take time to navigate the Rayan patrols. Stay safe, and keep the Heartstone secure. Eliana deactivated the beacon, her expression a mix of relief and determination. She looked at Zack, her eyes shining with renewed hope. We have allies on the way. Zack felt a surge of exhilaration. They weren't alone anymore. There was a chance, a real chance, that they might survive this. "All right," he said, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him. "Now we just have to hold out until they get here." Over the next few days, Zack and Eliana fortified the cabin, preparing for the inevitable Ryan attack. With each passing hour, their bond deepened, the Heartstone responding to their shared determination, its glow growing brighter with every act of resilience. They spent countless hours training, honing their skills and testing the limits of the Heartstone's power. Zack could feel the energy within him growing stronger, a force that felt both foreign and familiar, as if it had always been a part of him, waiting to be awakened. Finally, on the third night, the forest erupted in sound. Zack's sensors triggered, flashing an alert. Rayan forces, larger than ever, advancing on their position. He and Eliana exchanged a grim nod, their faces set with determination. This was it, their final stand. As the first wave of soldiers broke through the trees, Zack and Eliana stood side by side, the Heartstone's energy crackling between them like a storm. They fought with a fierce intensity, every strike, every movement a testament to the bond they had forged. The battle was brutal, each wave of soldiers stronger and more relentless than the last. But Zack and Eliana held their ground, their resolve unbreakable, and just as their strength began to falter, a blinding light filled the sky. Varian ships descended from above, their sleek forms cutting through the night as they unleashed a barrage of fire upon the Rayan forces. Commander Kale's voice echoed through Zack's communicator, his tone calm and commanding. "Hold your position. Help has arrived." With the arrival of their allies, the tide of battle shifted. The Rayan forces retreated, their ranks broken and scattered. Zack and Eliana stood together, battered but unbowed, as the Varian ships touched down around them. Commander Kale approached, his expression one of deep respect as he looked at Zack and Eliana. "Princess, you've done well. The Heartstone is safe, thanks to you both." Eliana smiled, glancing at Zack with a warmth that went beyond mere gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without him." As the Varians prepared to leave, Zack felt a pang of bittersweet emotion. He had fought for her, risked everything to protect her, and now she was returning to a world he could only imagine. But as Eliana looked at him, he saw a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Zack Hart," she said, her voice soft, "the Varian Empire could use a warrior like you." He grinned, his heart pounding with excitement and a sense of adventure he'd never felt before. "Well, Princess, I've never been one to back down from a challenge." And as they stepped aboard the Varian ship, bound for new worlds and new battles, Zack knew that his life and their story was only just beginning. Trials of the Varian Empire. As the Varian ship ascended from Earth, leaving the familiar blue-green planet far below, Zack's heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The cabin hummed with the energy of advanced technology beyond his wildest dreams. Lights glowed softly along the walls, and every surface was sleek, metallic, and carefully designed for efficiency and elegance. He looked around in awe, absorbing every detail, while Eliana watched him with a faint smile, clearly amused by his wide-eyed fascination. "First time on a starship," she teased, her tone warm. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I mean, I've been on a plane before, but this is something else." Commander Kale approached them from the far side of the cabin, his sharp eyes assessing Zack. Kale was imposing, taller and broader than Zack, with a commanding presence that made it clear he was not a man to be trifled with. His armor, dark with Varian insignia etched into the metal, gleamed under the ship's lighting. "Zack Hart," he said, his voice even but firm. "Princess Eliana speaks highly of you, but the Varian Empire does not easily trust outsiders, especially those without military training. Before we integrate you into our efforts against the Rayan Dominion, we must evaluate your abilities." Zack's instinct was to respond with humor, but one look at Kel's steely gaze made him reconsider. He nodded, keeping his expression serious. Understood, Commander. I'll do whatever it takes to prove myself. Kale gave a small nod of approval. Good. We will soon reach the Varian stronghold on the planet Saran. There, you'll undergo the trials of Korath. These trials are designed to test your strength, resilience, and loyalty. If you pass, you'll be recognized as a Varian ally and warrior. Zack exchanged a glance with Eliana, who gave him a reassuring nod. I know you can do this, she whispered. The Heartstone chose you for a reason. Taking a steadying breath, Zack nodded to Kale. I'm ready. The journey to Saran was swift. The Varian ship moved through space at speeds Zack could hardly comprehend, the stars outside the windows mere streaks of light. They finally arrived at the Varian stronghold, a massive fortress carved into the rugged cliffs of Saran, a world of dense forests and towering mountains. The fortress loomed ahead, its architecture both elegant and imposing, with high towers and intricate carvings that glowed faintly with Varian technology. Inside, the halls were filled with Varian warriors, their postures rigid, their gazes sharp and calculating. As Zack and Eliana walked through the corridors, whispers followed them, eyes lingering on Zack with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He was an outsider, an earthling from a world far removed from the battles of the galaxy, and he could feel the weight of their judgment. Kale led them to a large chamber at the heart of the fortress, where the trials of Korath would begin. The room was dimly lit, with only a few narrow beams of light piercing through the stone walls. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Zack could feel his heartbeat quicken as he looked around. A group of Varian soldiers stood to the side, their expressions unreadable, waiting to observe his performance. Kale stepped forward, his voice echoing through the chamber. Zack Hart, you'll undergo 3 trials. The first will test your physical endurance, the second your tactical skills, and the third your connection to the Heartstone. Only by succeeding in all 3 will you be deemed worthy of fighting alongside the Varian forces. Zack swallowed, nodding. I understand. Eliana placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. I'll be here, she said softly. Remember, you're not alone in this. He met her gaze, feeling a surge of confidence. With a nod, he turned to face Kale, ready to begin. Trial 1. The Gauntlet of Strength. The first trial was a grueling test of physical endurance. Kale led Zack to a massive training arena filled with obstacles, towering walls to scale, heavy weights to lift, and an intricate network of traps and challenges designed to push even the strongest Varian warriors to their limits. Zack knew his strength would be tested far beyond anything he'd ever experienced on Earth. Your task is simple, Kale said, his voice unwavering. Reach the end of the arena within the allotted time. Zack took a deep breath, steeling himself. With a signal from Kale, the trial began. He sprinted forward, dodging and weaving through the first set of obstacles. His body strained against the weight of the equipment, and his muscles screamed as he scaled the walls, but he pressed on, determined not to show weakness. Each step was harder than the last, his breaths coming in gasps, but he kept moving, fueled by sheer willpower and a growing sense of purpose. As he reached the halfway point, his legs threatened to give out, but in that moment, he felt a warmth spreading through him, the familiar sensation of the Heartstone's energy, lending him strength. Eliana watched from the sidelines, her gaze filled with encouragement, and Zack felt his resolve harden. With a final burst of energy, he pushed himself over the last wall and collapsed at the finish line, his body trembling with exhaustion. Kale nodded, a hint of approval in his gaze. You have passed the first trial. Trial 2, the test of strategy. For the second trial, Zack was led to a holographic chamber where a simulation of a battle scenario played out before him. Kale explained that Zack would be required to strategize and lead a team of Varian soldiers through a complex series of tactical challenges. Each move would be judged, and any mistake could mean failure. The simulation began, and Zack found himself in the midst of a chaotic battle environment. Virian soldiers awaited his commands, their eyes fixed on him with a mix of doubt and anticipation. Zack took a deep breath, recalling everything he'd learned from his skirmishes on Earth and the tactics he'd studied in preparation for this moment. He issued his first command, positioning the soldiers strategically to defend against an incoming assault. The simulation responded with a barrage of attacks, but Zack remained calm, adjusting his strategy on the fly. He led his team through each scenario, his mind racing as he adapted to the ever-changing challenges. The simulation intensified, and Zack felt the pressure mounting, but he held his ground, guiding the Varian soldiers through each obstacle with precision and determination. Finally, as the last wave of simulated enemies fell, the room fell silent, and Kel's voice echoed through the chamber. "You have passed a second trial. Your tactical instincts are adequate," Kel said, though Zack detected a hint of begrudging respect in his tone. Trial 3. The Bond of the Heartstone. The final trial was the most mysterious, and Zack could feel the tension thickening as Kel led him to a secluded chamber deep within the fortress. Eliana followed, her expression serious. "This trial is unique," she explained, "and it's the one that will determine whether the Heartstone has truly bonded with you. You'll need to channel the Heartstone's energy, allowing it to resonate with your own spirit. This isn't about strength or strategy, but a connection, a fusion of purpose." Zack nodded, feeling a flicker of nerves. He had relied on the Heartstone before, but this felt different, more intimate. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes and focusing on the warmth of the artifact. Slowly, he reached out, feeling for the Heartstone's presence within him. At first, there was only silence, but then, gradually, he felt the familiar warmth spreading through him, a gentle, pulsing energy that filled his senses. He concentrated, letting himself sink deeper into the connection, his thoughts merging with the Heartstone's ancient energy. Images began to flash through his mind, scenes of Varian history, of battles fought and victories won, of warriors who had come before him. And then he saw Eliana. In his mind's eye, she stood beside him, her gaze steady, her spirit unwavering. He felt her presence like a guiding light, her determination and courage blending with his own. In that moment, he understood the depth of their connection, the bond they had forged in the fires of battle. The Heartstone's energy surged, filling him with a power that felt both exhilarating and humbling. He opened his eyes, and Kel nodded, his expression unreadable but respectful. "You have passed the final trial," Kel said. "The Heartstone has chosen you as its bearer. You are no longer an outsider, you are a warrior of the Varian Empire." Zack felt a surge of pride, glancing at Eliana, who smiled, her eyes filled with pride and warmth. They had come so far together, and now, standing here in the heart of the Varian Empire, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't known was possible. Over the next days, Zack was welcomed into the Varian ranks, training with the soldiers, learning their ways, and adapting to their advanced technology. His skills grew, his bond with the Heartstone deepened, and he and Eliana became an inseparable team, their partnership recognized and respected by even the most seasoned warriors. But as they prepared for the next phase of their mission, an assault on a Rayan stronghold, the gravity of their task weighed heavily on them. The Rayan dominion was vast and powerful, and their forces were ruthless. The upcoming battle would be unlike any Zack had faced before, and he knew that the stakes had never been higher. One evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the fortress, Eliana turned to him, her gaze solemn. "Zack," she began, her voice soft but firm, "no matter what happens, know that you've proven yourself beyond any doubt. You're more than an ally, you're a part of Varia." He looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and determination in his eyes. "Thank you, Eliana. I never imagined I'd be here, fighting alongside you, part of something this incredible." She smiled, reaching out and placing a hand on his. "Together, we have a chance to make history, to protect not just Varia, but all worlds threatened by the Rayan dominion." They stood in silence, the weight of their mission filling the space between them, a bond that had been tested and strengthened through every trial. And as the stars stretched out before them, Zack knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with courage, driven by a purpose greater than himself and united with the warrior by his side. With the Heartstone at his core and Eliana as his guide, Zack was ready to face the Rayan Dominion and whatever awaited them in the unknown expanse of the galaxy. Together, they would fight, protect, and perhaps even change the course of history.